subject like a second.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. So this morning we're going to be talking to you about cross-examination and tips for when you're cross-examining someone and when you're being cross-examined yourself, and how you can leverage the answers you get and the answers you give in your rebuttal speeches.
This is a speech that a lot of people undervalue.
Mhm.
It can, for some judges, it can definitely like be a very good thing for you to be like very dominant in cross-examination, and dominant meaning like able to answer questions and able to effectively ask your opponent questions that they can't answer.
Yeah, a lot of judges, like, they don't flow cross-examination, but they'll either like still listen to it, or they'll like take notice if you bring it up in your rebuttal speech. You can literally get up there and say, my opponent said this in cross-examination, and here's what that means for debate, for like the round.
So these are definitely valuable speeches.
Yes. Okay, so what you're going to learn. We went over this bit, but you're going to learn how to manage cross-examination on both sides. You're going to learn how to capitalize on cross-ex and rebuttal. And you're going to watch an example of cross-examination from a Nats final round. Okay, so let's look at cross-examination when you're the one asking questions. So the first thing you want to do is you want to ask pointed questions. So you want to like make it clear like the point you're asking, and you don't want to have long-winded questions that go on forever. Like, you want to have it pretty short and straight to the point, so it's easy for the judge and your opponent to understand what you're asking.
Good examples of like pointed questions are like, why is this true, or like how, or like some sort of like justification or warrant asking question on someone's argument.
Yeah. You want to have pre-prepared questions. Now, one important thing with this is that you don't necessarily need to write the questions down, but you should at least like think in your head of some like generic questions you could ask in an affirmative case or a negative case. For instance, on negative, like if you're cross-examining the negative and the negative is talking about, if the negative is talking about economic growth decreases poverty and lifts people out of it and improves like healthcare and social infrastructure, you could ask questions like think of questions to ask with that, like how is this more important than like the effects that environmental damage has on the economy, and how would this growth still occur and last through environmental damage? Things like those.
A good way to also prepare for questions, or like yeah, have prepared questions, is that like while you're listening to the opponent's constructive cases or constructive speeches, just like write down like things next to your flow and like little question marks,
Yeah.
perhaps, or like just like a little indicator on the specific part of their case that you want to question them about,
Mhm.
or are curious. So
Yeah. For example, like when I flow in a debate round, I'll flow the affirmative case in black and like their responses. I'll flow the negative case and responses in red. And then any questions I have on the affirmative case, I will just like write in blue pen a little question mark and I'll circle it. And that's all I do. Because normally like you'll have the question in your head and be like, oh, I should ask this. And if you write a little question mark on it, normally that's enough to jog your memory on what you're trying to ask there. And that's really effective too, because you don't want to get bogged down like writing a specific question word for word on your flow, because then you're going to miss something they're saying because they're still giving their constructive speech.
yeah, so just something like this.
Yeah.
A little indicator on your flow.
Something you should do is you should call them out if they're dodging questions. So a lot of times you might ask a question and it's like going to look bad for them, or they don't know how to answer it, so they're just like not going to, or they're going to like try and answer something else that your question isn't asking. So you can literally just say like, okay, thank you, but I'm sorry, that's not what my question is asking. I'm asking you if you can show me, something like that.
A good way to like know when your opponent's dodging is like if they say like the phrase, you're missing the point, or like that's not the point of the argument, or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Make them answer the question you asked.
Another way that you can tell it is if they start like rehashing their case. Like sometimes you'll like ask them a question and they'll be like, what my case is saying is that, and like it's not directly answering the question. Take time in cross-examination to write down important answers they give you. So you can do this in like the same color pen as the questions, but like if you ask a question that you can like majorly capitalize on in rounds, like for example, if I'm negative and I'm talking about my case is going to talk about innovation leads to like more efficient like agriculture practices and reduces the impact that agriculture practices have on the environment. And the affirmative case is about environmental change. If you can get up there and ask, okay, so you agree that climate change is bad. So do you agree that we should we should seek the most efficient ways to reduce climate change with as little of a negative impact on people as possible, right? And if they say like, sure, yeah, then you should take time to like write down, and then you can say in like rebuttal, they said that we need to look for the most efficient ways to combat climate change. I show you that economic development does that because it produces innovation, making technology more efficient.
You can definitely win rounds off of what your opponent says, specifically in parts of like the observation or the framework. So like if you have an observation, like if you're running one that's framing the round in a very specific way, and they like, or if they have one and you like kind of question them about it and get them to admit that their observation isn't doing much or like they don't like achieve it themselves, etc., you can easily win rounds off of the questions you ask in cross-examination.
Yeah. Something you can do too is just ask why. Now, don't get like completely annoying with this and just keep asking why. But if you ask a question for them to like justify something, or are you saying that this type of manufacturing practice causes climate change or something like that, and they say yeah, just ask them why. Like, try and make your opponent justify their own case, because if they don't know their case well enough, they're going to end up stumbling in cross-examination and not providing good warrants, which you can capitalize on in your rebuttal speech.
You can also ask for like links between arguments.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if you ask why this happens, then you can be like, how does this link to link or whatever.
Yeah.
One other thing though, you don't ever want to like waste time in cross-examination. So if you don't have a question, don't just like stand there and like write. Just like keep asking these why questions, like Sam said.
Yeah. Okay. Cross-examining studies. So there are plenty of studies that are read in debate, and a lot of times, yeah, Kira?
What do you feel about like if someone's like giving like an incredibly long answer, like 45 seconds to a minute?
Yeah.
You should stop them.
Yeah, you should cut them off.
How do you do it without being rude?
Okay.
Just be okay.
Yeah, say like, oh, yeah, it's like just say,
You after like anything you say.
yeah.
What do I do if I've done that and judges vote me down for that?
I don't know. Like, how often does it happen?
It's only happened a couple times.
Okay, I'd say that like it depends on the judge, but normally I'll say like I'll just keep on saying thank you, and then it's just something like that. Like trying to assert yourself and be like, yeah, I get the point, without like coming off as like super like aggressive in it. I don't know. Like, it depends on the judge.
Yeah, that's like another thing that cross-examination it's kind of dodgy. Like, the way the judge interprets your like cadence or
Yeah.
your attitude towards your opponent is gonna vary between judges. So it's kind of one thing you can't control about cross-ex.
Yeah. Okay, so cross-examining studies. Plenty of studies are read in debate, and a lot of times it'll be something like a percentage statistic that helps them quantify their impacts. And a lot of times studies will fit fine with what people want them to say, but a lot of times they won't, and they'll try and shoehorn the study into their case and potentially like leave out or ignore certain things about the study. That doesn't make it a reason to affirm or negate.
Another thing that's important about studies is that like there are definitely people who use them wrong. Like,
Yeah.
I've run into people who've cut the abstract of the study
Mhm.
or have used like use the part of the study that introduces the problem like on the other side, but not include the conclusion where they concluded that problem is wrong. So studies can definitely be something that you examine in the process.
Yes. And so with that, some strategies to do it really quickly is like ask for specifics. So for example, was like the methodology of the study, like was a direct link to their impact? Like a lot of times studies will look at, let's say, the effect of climate change, and like they'll like say, here's China's here's China's manufacturing processes that contribute to climate change. Here's like all the terrible impacts that climate change cause. And a lot of times, like some studies won't like directly link like manufacturing process in China contributes this much to climate change, or they don't tell you how much of a reduction it'll actually cost. It's just like a general impact about all of everything that contributes to climate change worldwide. If they don't like have specifics or know what the methodology is, which they probably won't, I feel like a lot of South Dakota debaters especially are bad at reading the entire card, which is something that's good for you. Literally just call the card yourself and ask to read it. So the first you can look at what they cut and look in between at like what they didn't read, because there might be something there. And then you can also follow the link and just like control F, like conclusions, results, and like limitations. Because a lot of times studies will include like limitations of their study or what they couldn't address. And that might be something you can capitalize on of like, here's why this study is short-sighted and doesn't take something into account that the negative addresses. Also, you should look it up and round for future use, because if it's like a study and it's like a good study that sounds amazing, there's probably something up with it. And if you search it up and like figure out that it's not saying exactly what they say it is, you can like own them next time in cross-examination and just be like, okay, so you cite Chenoweth in 2017 and say this about them, but doesn't Chenoweth also say in the exact same study that, and then like explain how the card they cite actually helps your side. So it's a really good way to like make cross-ex look better for you and preempt some arguments.
Another example of that is like when we have topics talk, like we talked about when bias matters, and an example that was given was like when we're debating about some specific thing that some specific industry would have a motivation to promote.
Yeah.
So on the, I think it was the laws topic, or maybe military aid topic, there was some evidence used about like how military aid is good, but it was produced by like military like companies.
Yeah.
So that was like a bias that I pointed out and used.
Mm-hmm. And like an important thing to know is that like if you're talking about like green energy good or something and you're citing it from like an environmental advocacy group, that's not necessarily like a poor study or say this is biased. But if it's something where it's like a like think tank that's funded by people with political interests like the fossil fuel industry, then clearly they're going to have incentives to skew it. So it just like kind of depends on the industry, who it is, how it's funded. Setting traps. Something you should do in cross-examination is set traps for your opponent that might seem fine to answer for them, and then you can capitalize on it later. So, and I literally did this Saturday in a PF round, and Aditya and I made it into a voter. So it's really good, just like, for example, what the example I just gave with like green technology and like making or like combating climate change the most efficient. An affirmative that's running climate change is of course going to agree that we should try and mitigate climate change as efficiently as possible. So you can ask that in cross-examination and they'll agree to it, and then you can get up in your like rebuttal speech as the negative and say they agreed that we need to mitigate climate change in the most effective way possible. That's a burden that you need to prove in the round, and the negative does it better. Also, you can set like framework traps about like why one takes precedence over the other or why comes first. For example, if you're running like social contract theory and someone is running like justice as dues, you can be like, why are people do certain things, or why are people do certain things from the government? Or does this mean, okay, or you can ask like, if people are due certain things, does that mean we have an obligation to ensure people get those dues? Things like that that set a reason why your framework comes first. Of like, okay, they say people are like deserve what they're due, and they admitted that that means governments have an obligation to give people what they are due, which means this is like social contract theory is underpinning their theory. Things not to do when asking questions. Don't just ask questions to fill time. That's kind of what Prasoon touched on. Don't just like constantly ask why just because you need something to say. Another important thing is a lot of times debaters will, like in cross-ex, they'll just like ask like, okay, so your value is this, right? Your criterion is this, right? Your contention 1 is this, your subpoint A is this. Like, that's not garnering you any offense or making, or like stuff you can capitalize on in round. It's just asking your opponent to, 1, repeat their case, which can allow them to rehash their case and make their links and impacts more explicit to the judge. So if anything, it only does harms to you.
If you do want to ask questions that clarify parts of their case, like ask them what their contention 2 was, for example, but then continue questioning them
Yes.
about that contention. Don't just move on once you've like written it down.
Yeah, like if you miss a tagline for a contention or a subpoint, of course you should ask clarification about that. But if you have it written down and you're pretty sure you understand what it is, don't just ask it to fill time. Oh yeah, another thing is don't argue or get frustrated in cross-examination because that can come off really bad. And when you start arguing with your opponent or trying to rebut their arguments in cross-examination, that can be an issue because you're suddenly like telling your opponent how you're going to like respond to their argument, which can give them some like free prep time when you're prepping them. And when you like get frustrated, you're more likely to say something that might not come off well or say something that just doesn't further offense for you. So you want to try and always like stay in the moment. And if your opponent is being dodgy or not asking questions or not answering questions in like a fully clear way, just like don't try and get heated about it. Try and stay calm and capitalize on it and further your cross-examination to garner offense for yourself.
Another thing you don't want to do while in CX cross-X is like look at your opponent. Like it's
Yeah.
just a norm to look at the judge and like sit forward.
Yeah, like let's say Catherine and I are the two debaters and the three in the back are the judges. And we're in cross-examination. I will like not look at Catherine at all. I will just like talk to the judges even when I'm asking questions. This is what I just talked about. Don't preview your case or your responses in your rebuttal because it gives your opponent free prep time. Like if you like bring up a rebuttal to one of their arguments, and that means that they're able to predict what your arguments are going to be before you ever say them, and so they'll have responses better thought out. So, for example, the first one, isn't it true? So like let's say the app is talking about the climate crisis, and you get up there as Neg and say, isn't it true that technological innovation can better combat the climate crisis? That's probably a bad question or a bad way to phrase it because the affirmative like knows you're running technological innovation now and they can think through responses to it. A better way that you could like frame it is your contention one is talking about the harms of climate change, correct? They'd say yeah. And you'd say, so you would agree that finding the most efficient methods to combat climate change is good. Like, it's a bit more hidden at what you're getting at or how specifically you're going to link that the negative is better able to combat climate change. So it's better for you because you still get them to concede ground for you that you can use in rebuttal without specifically telling them how you're going to rebut them. Okay, so things to do when getting crossed. Things you should do is try and rehash your case, or if they ask you something your case is saying, make the impacts and like links as clear to the judge as possible. And with this, you should know what your case says. A lot of times people will like be asked questions specifically about their case, or like your contention one is saying this, right? And people have to like relook at their case and figure out what it says. Ideally, you would like be able to like know your framework, what your value and criterion is, what your contention one says, and what your subpoints say all from memory. Just because that way you're able to respond more on the fly, you look more prepared, and comes off a lot better to the judge. You should try and take control of cross and have responses ready. So the more you're able to leverage your case, explain the nuances of it, and explain why their questions aren't like getting at the warrants or the links of what you're saying, or you can you can qualify what they're asking you, it's allowing you to like show that you're prepared for their answers and you can like defend your case better. The more unprepared you look, the worse it looks to the judge and the more likely they're going to buy the responses your opponent has. Also, make sure you like be wary of traps. So a lot of times if your opponent asks a really vague question, it might be like trying to get at something or they're trying to get you to concede something. A lot of times you can ask just like, can you like, I'm sorry, I don't fully get what the question is saying, can you phrase it in a different way? Or I know one thing someone said, that they're like a nationals champion in like the 2020, is like they said if they don't know what their opponent's getting at, they'll just start they'll just start repeating their case. I don't fully recommend that because we just said that if you do that, then they can just get up there and say, I'm sorry, but you're not answering my question. And so now you're the one that looks bad. It's better to just say like, I'm sorry, can you like clarify the question?
One thing with that though, like you definitely want to answer questions in a way that takes more time than
Yes.
a way that doesn't take more time.
Yeah, it's like really weird. Like like when you're cross-examining someone, you don't want to let them take time at all. That's like what Kira was talking about. Like they were like using 45 seconds, just going on and on answering one question. That's really good that the person being cross-ex did that, but you want to try and mitigate that as much as possible. And that means like the more direct questions you can ask or asking for simple justifications kind of makes it harder for them to go on long tangents justifying what you're trying to ask if you're asking specific pointed questions. Okay. Some things not to do when getting crossed. Don't be super vague when like you're answering questions. You should like be able to like specifically link like, yes, I tell you that the reason that China is able to combat the climate crisis is because they contribute 30% to CO2 emissions. That means all the effects that climate change has, from poverty to housing to lack of healthcare, can be effectively combated by China because it's in such a good position. And when you're getting crossed, you shouldn't ignore your framework or your other cards you have in case. If they're asking you specifically about like your contention 1 subpoint B and the impacts it has, you can say like, you can like draw on your framing and showing, yeah, because like we need to prioritize environmental justice in this round, that means that the impacts that this card has should take like precedent in the round because it has all these like negative effects. And you can also leverage other cards. So like you can talk about how, yeah, I talk about how climate change is leading to all these detrimental effects, and my subpoint A shows that the specific reason that this occurs is because of China's manufacturing process. So just because you're being asked about one specific part of your case doesn't mean you can't leverage other parts of your case to answer the question. And don't like turn it into a speech. Like Prasoon said, you should take up as much time as possible, but also at the same time, it can be, like the more you turn into speech, the more likely you are to like just go on long tangents that aren't like directly addressing the question. So like answer the question, but make sure you're not giving up unnecessary ground to your opponent because you might like run out of words or saying, or like not know where you're going with what you're saying and accidentally end up conceding something.
Don't like talk for the sake of talking.
Yeah.
You can answer a question in a way that's like still direct, but you still have to like explain things to do that.
Yeah, like just because you're using up time, that doesn't mean that you're not making points.
Right. Also, one more thing about the don't thing is like if you're getting asked about a card, don't ever reread the card unless they ask a specific line in it.
Yeah.
Like that just looks bad to the judge and it makes it look like you don't understand what your arguments are saying.
Yeah, and that's the thing about like knowing what your case says and what it does. Like you should be able to know what each card says, what it, like the implication it has on its debate, the links you have to your impacts and what those impacts are.
Alright, so now we're gonna watch a cross-examination of this case.
So for quick context, this was the Nationals 2019 topic. It was resolved, violent revolution is a just response to political oppression. So
the new best way to
some
make money
important things to know
online
with
that
this
nobody's
is
talking
going to be the
about is something
negative
you've never heard of
cross-examining the
before.
affirmative
It's
case.
using
Things to know about the affirmative case for
240
context. The affirmative is going to,
Read it.
oh yeah,
I'll read it. You can just
okay. So the affirmative is going to say that one, violent revolution, while not, like, the affirmative doesn't need to defend that violent revolution is always effective compared to nonviolent revolution. They just need to show that, like, it's a just response in a toolbox and that, like, always the oppressed people in these regimes maintain a fundamental right to defend themselves and protect their life. They also say that a really good way to combat authoritarian regimes is through guerrilla warfare. So not modern warfare, like out in a battlefield, but like in urban areas, like kind of like in the woods, like, and like not specifically like traditional warfare means, but like in urban areas, targeting military institutions and running away, hiding, striking again when you can.
What was the other thing you ran?
The other thing he ran was that,
You ran like some example or like a
oh yeah, he's going to specifically say, like, hammer in on examples like the American Revolution as a historical example of guerrilla warfare being able to overcome a powerful military institution like the British Empire.
And he's also going to mention a study a lot.
Yeah.
The only thing you really need to know about this is that it just like it's not comprehensive, which the opponent will very well think.
Yeah. So on this, take notes about what the affirmative does. That's really good when they're answering questions. And what the negative does to take control of this cross-sex round and make the affirmative look bad.
What does the neg
The negative case is going to say, that's another thing. Look at how the negative is going to preempt some of their arguments or like have it in the back of the mind and judge before they even read their case. So the negative is going to say that violent revolutions result in like crackdown by the state and mass death in the process because revolutions are always bloody. They're also going to say that a lot of times revolutionary leaders, like just because they like overthrow the dictator, they're more likely to institute another dictator in their place because they used violent means, and that's going to result in violent ends to maintain that power. Third and final important thing they're going to say is, I'll get to your question in 1 second. A third and final thing they're going to say is that there are ways that people in these regimes can overthrow authoritarian regimes without having to pick up a gun, and she's going to specifically talk about diaspora communities who flee their country and then use their power as a diaspora to like make change through the international community, through non-governmental organizations, and through the international governmental organizations.
Doesn't Nick also have an observation that like you shouldn't use really old?
Yes, and that's another thing. I don't think it's going to come up in cross-examination, but negative also has an observation that works really well in this round, and she says, we actually read it in observations, and it was saying that like 16th and 17th century philosophers that talk about revolution are bad to cite for justifying modern revolutions because it doesn't take into account the means of violence used, the type of weaponry that's used, or how states have become savvier to cracking down on revolutionary groups. And she's going to leverage that against his first justification that cites John Locke about how the oppressed maintain this fundamental right to self-defense and to revolt against an authoritarian regime. So take notes, watch what they do that you think is good, what you think is bad, and we'll talk about it later.
what does neg run for framework?
Neg runs for framework a value of justice and a criterion of maximizing human rights. Is here maximizing human rights or protecting human rights? And then AF's framework is justice with a criterion of resisting oppression. Oh, it's like it's minimizing structural oppression, actually.
Okay, I'm just gonna put MSP.
Yeah.
Structural violence and oppression are low-key referring to the same thing. So
Yeah.
Okay. So does everyone understand what's on the board? Any questions about whatever any of those terms mean?
If I mute my mic, will the audio still be heard on stream? Because I'm worried about like a feedback thing.
Yeah, you should probably do it just.
Okay. If it doesn't play for online people, just search it up later. Yeah.
Ready? Everyone ready? Okay. Are any means of violence just as a response to political oppression?
Right, so I think violence is a just option for a few reasons. First of all, because the oppressed are guaranteed this innate right to self-defense, which allows them to push back against their oppressors.
First question to ask, considering his observation was tool in the toolbox, she asked, is any tool of like violence justified? Which is a really good way to talk about like the tool in the toolbox argument.
I'm asking you more specifically, what type of violence is allowed?
Right, so I think there are lots of types of violence that are allowed, but I think the most effective means would probably be guerrilla warfare, because guerrilla warfare allows you to overcome the power disparity between a really oppressive government and a pretty weak people.
Okay, guerrilla groups often use things like sexual coercion and rape, innocent children or civilians being killed. Do you advocate for those types of violence too?
No, there's a very big distinction between terrorism and guerrilla warfare. Terrorism is when the groups specifically target innocent civilians. Guerrilla warfare is what happened in the American Revolution, when you specifically target government troops.
Okay, can you tell me an example of a violent revolution recently that has only targeted the government and not harmed innocent civilians?
Violent revolutions, I think there are lots of examples. I think we can look at freedom fighters in Syria, for instance, in specific cases, not ISIS. I'm of course not talking about ISIS, but I'm talking about like the Free Syrian Army, where they're able to actually effectively counter Assad and protect innocent people.
All right, but in that case, didn't these actions lead to a major state of chaos with almost hundreds of thousands of citizens dying in that country?
I think that's the fault of the government. I think the actual rebels are being very effective at actually countering Assad and at actually protecting innocent civilians. And I think we can look to more historic examples too, going back to the example of the American Revolution, where the United States military, which was one of the weakest on the planet, was able to overcome the British military, which had the strongest naval force, which had the strongest land force, in a decisive victory. And that really attests to the power of guerrilla warfare.
Okay.
It's able to overcome these oppressive
You
regimes.
specifically cite that we're able to overcome oppression. Do you have an example of a government that's formed recently from violent revolution that doesn't perpetuate more oppression?
Right, so I think there are a couple problems with your analysis. First of all, we can never definitively say that one variable will cause a more oppressive government or a less oppressive government. In fact, Prworski 12, a meta-study conducted from Duke University, concluded that in the body of available political science, in the body of available statistics, it's impossible to come to a definitive statistical conclusion that one variable will lead to a better government.
But that's not my question. I'm asking you for an example of a violent revolution that didn't perpetuate oppression.
Right, I can give you better than examples. I can provide you with an empirical study of past historical examples, which says that nonviolence does contribute to
Do you have any of those examples available?
I mean, I can provide you with the empirical study.
Okay, that's fine. If revolutions lead to government that don't actually reflect the oppressed, is that a successful one?
I think insofar as it's gotten rid of the existing structural oppression, yes. We should worry about overthrowing the government first, then worry about creating a new government.
Okay, thank you.
One thing that she did really well is cross-examination. Yes.
She talked and like just kept trying to make it have more options. So she was building up to her idea that she can't use like historic examples for this topic.
So, any other good stuff?
That's a different way to it.
Kira?
Sorry, the mic is.
It is, yeah.
She made sure that like he couldn't like dodge around her question and that he could like that it was exemplified that he didn't have an example. He had a comprehensive study.
Yeah, so like when she asked for an example, he kind of rambled about in a study that said you can't use examples, which doesn't make any sense. So she was very quick to point that out.
Quick question on that too. Did you notice how he still didn't like provide a specific like historical like a specific example in the modern day, and she just like let it go. Like she figured the point was being made well enough to the judges that he doesn't have a modern day example on hand that she can still like get offense on. So she's able to like capitalize on him not being able to respond to this argument without turning it into arguing in cross-examination. Is there anything you noticed that the affirmative did really well?
Affirmative being the guy.
Yeah.
I guess he tried to dodge the questions, which is like he didn't really have anything else to do.
Yeah.
He was kind of just like,
Yeah.
If you notice, he tended to like use a lot of time, and she kind of just let him because she realized he wasn't saying much, and the judges probably realized that, but he was able to like use time well to answer questions and spread out. Like,
yeah, when you say that's a good tactic to like, if it's clear that they're just rambling or like talking for the sake of talking, like let them do that instead of like interrupting them to ask another question.
Honestly, I think probably. Like sometimes like it depends on what questions you have that you want to cover in cross-examination. If they're like rambling on a point that's not at all important and you have like 3 other things that you can get to that you think will be really impactful in the round, then cut them off. But if you like don't have much else to get to and you think this is an important point, it might be good to let them ramble. If you don't think they know what they're talking about, they might stumble over the words, they might not be able to perfectly justify it, and you can capitalize on what they say. It's contextual if you should let them ramble or not. Another thing did you notice? Did you notice how he was constantly hammering what was said in his case, even if it wasn't like directly brought up. Like she asked for like tactics that revolutionary groups can do that are justified, and she wasn't specifically focusing on guerrilla warfare, but he brought it up as an example he provides in his case. Now, like your opinions on like if guerrilla warfare is effective, if the American Revolution is really a good example, is like is like separated from the fact that that's in his case and he's able to effectively leverage it in cross-ex to the point of using your case to make your point and defend against cross-examination.
Also, I just realized the mic turned on because I turned on the volume, so that's how it works. Anyways, another thing that she did really well was, like, the second question she asked, like, I forgot what I was gonna say. Oh, right. So like when he brought up examples from his case, like we told you guys not to like preempt rebuttals, but I think what she did was like fine in this instance, where this because he like started bringing up like guerrilla warfare and the American Revolution, but for guerrilla warfare specifically, she brought up how like instances of guerrilla warfare didn't necessarily like use just means, so maybe like using like allowing any tool would like lead for worse unjust violations.
Yeah. Like, it really depends on, like, what you're trying to get them on, and insofar as, like, her response isn't just, like, a claim of, like, wouldn't you agree that technological innovation is, like, better? It's more so, like, okay, you advocate for this, but doesn't this, in a lot of instances, lead to very negative effects where the harms outweigh the benefits towards these people? And, like, can you justify this? And, like, asking them to do that when it's, like, a really good point you're making, like she does, can make him, like, stumble or falter over his words.
And again, okay, but that's not the question I'm asking. Very good phrase to use.
Yes.
Yeah, anything else we missed?
No. I think we can go on to the negative being cross-examined now, and you can show how this first cross-examination still plays into that round, and how what the affirmative does to try and get ground, and how the negative not just defends herself, but also gains offense in this one, even when she's being cross-examined.
All right, is everyone ready? Mm-hmm. Let's begin. So let's start on your contention one about how violent revolution allows illegitimate leaders in, right?
Yes.
So you talk about how violent means lead to violent ends, right?
Correct.
And then you bring up this Perkowski 18 study, right?
No, I read to you a study from Kim.
I'm talking about the study that says that there's 3 times more likely to be mass killings.
That's from Carnes and Chenoweth.
That's Carnes and Chenoweth.
Yes.
Okay. Where did the sample size from that study come from?
It came from a large amount of selections of both violent and nonviolent revolutions.
Okay. What was in the sample? How'd they determine what was included?
They basically just chose whether or not they had enough information and then chose and selected violent and nonviolent revolutions. And in those cases, under the study or the specific citation I write, it talks about whether or not a country was willing to use a mass killing against that revolution.
Okay, gotcha. So in your worlds, can the oppressed seek any recourse?
Yes, I argue they can seek recourse through nonviolent means, but if that fails, it's preferable to leave the country than fight, because fighting will not only risk your life, but the rest of the lives in your country.
So let's talk about nonviolence. Have you provided any holistic statistics to prove that nonviolence works?
Right, I'm not saying that nonviolence will always work. I also say that violence will not always work. If anything, violence receives more violent responses and doesn't solve for oppression.
But can you
yes.
But can you provide any holistic statistics to prove that nonviolence will work?
Well, the statistics I read to you in my second contention says that it's less likely to encounter mass killings.
But does it overthrow the governments?
I'm not specifically saying that it's more successful at that. I'm saying the thing that's most successful is actually fleeing your country and using your power as a diaspora, as a refugee to make change.
So how is an oppressed person supposed to flee their country? How is someone stuck in North Korea supposed to flee their country when the government is shooting them at the border?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thought experiment. You cite to me it's hard for people to leave from North Korea. I argue it's easier for them to leave than to find military weapons, train themselves and their friends to overthrow that government and not cause mass chaos in the country.
Okay, so what happened when
We get a standing ovation for a cross-examination. This has got to be the most embarrassing moment of this.
Yeah, question. Why was that a really good response? Wait.
Any takers?
I mean, because the example of North Korea, it pretty clearly shows that, it's not very easy to, gather arms and have a group and storm the government. It's easier for them to leave, even if it's still hard.
Yeah, so, the affirmative was trying to show that like fleeing your country might not be 100% of the times effective, or it has downsides. The negative got up there and said, yeah, sure, but look at the alternative. Like, it's way worse in an affirmative world. So that was like really good. She's not just like defending the efficacy of the negatives, like advocation for diasporas, but she's also pointing out that even if it has downsides or isn't very effective, it's still more justified because it doesn't result in mass chaos and death. And like it's like easier to do than gathering arms, training your friends, overthrowing the regime without instituting another dictator.
And this is also why we say that like some cross-examination questions can like low-key win rounds. This is kind of a unique example where there's a whole crowd. But think about if you're a judge in this scenario and the entire crowd behind you is cheering for one side, you kind of get a little bit persuaded for that.
Also, this guy was definitely thrown off by that. I would
no.
start crying.
No. If you like,
Absolutely frazzled.
okay, wait. Like go back like 20 seconds and just watch his reaction.
So that's a really interesting thought experiment. You cite to me it's hard for people to leave from North Korea. I argue it's easier for them to leave than to find military weapons, train themselves and their friends to overthrow that government and not cause mass chaos in the country.
Okay, so what happened when So what happened?
North Korea.
Yeah.
Killed Kim Jong-un.
This guy lost on a 12-1 decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He almost got swept at the.
You got smoked.
He did get smoked. All right, so let's like go over what else she did well. She was clearly very confident in her answers, very, very like in control of cross-examination. You could tell like when he was trying, like she kind of pitied him, like she was like, "What?" And she's like, "Yes." Like she kind of gave him the opportunity to ask another question.
Yeah. And
Um,
did you notice at the very start of cross-examination, he was asking about a specific point on her first contention and about a specific author? Okay. Why might the affirmative have been doing that? Heidi? Yeah, no, exactly. Like, he probably had a response about this specific author, Prikorsky 18, and he thought that she read it, and she just didn't. And so that kind of, like, stopped his train of questioning, and now he suddenly needed to, like, come up with more arguments than just, this is what the author says.
yeah. Yeah.
One thing I want to add though is that that's probably not going to happen on this topic. It
Yeah.
has like through like a whole season. Like for example, there was a study by this guy called A where he like stated that like in some cases when people in hospitals go on strike, deaths increase. But he also said in some cases death decreases. But I had people like citing it as like deaths only increase. So like I pointed out the contradictory because it's something where like if you encounter the same piece of evidence over and over, you know, you might look at it, but probably not during our practice round.
Yeah, like, this is something that can be really useful, like, in season, when you know, like, what people are running. You can look it up, figure out that the author is, like, qualifying their arguments or explain that, like, this is why I'm saying happens, but here's reasons why that might not be true, and it can undermine their own case by showing the author is, like, somewhere in the middle ground and saying both can be effective.
All right, let's watch that one more time and then finish up this.
Supposed to flee their country. How is someone stuck in North Korea supposed to flee their country?
North Korea. I argue it's easier for them to leave than to find military weapons, train themselves and their friends to overthrow that government and not cause mass chaos in the country.
Okay, so what happened when what happened when refugees fled Syria?
Right, so not only have we gained way more international attention, but even then,
Right.
international groups have started to reflect and notice that issue.
But when refugees left Syria, weren't they forced to go into refugee camps? Weren't they faced with white nationalism in Europe? Weren't they faced with a ton of backlash that ended up continuing their cycle of oppression?
Yes. But I articulate that their outcome is better than those who died in Syria after the violent revolution when their government unleashed chemical weapons onto innocent civilians, all due to the revolution.
Okay, so let's talk about this idea of innocent deaths. Are innocent deaths justified?
Like kind of gets like the final word and you just have to be like, okay, let's go to this.
Yeah.
Because you know you kind of lost the argument there.
In the long term if they can actually stop political oppression?
You
if
have
they can
yet to give me an example of where innocent
but
deaths have led to outcomes.
let's talk about hypothetical.
Even if you could provide that to me, I would where innocent
but
deaths have led to outcomes.
let's
Even
talk about
if you
hypothetical.
could even if you could provide that to me, I would argue that like using 400,000 innocent lives as a bartering chip is never something
But
just.
let's talk about a hypothetical. If we can kill some innocent people in the short term to create a less oppressive government, to create a democratic government that doesn't oppress the people, is that justified?
Again, I don't think you can prove that to me, but if you can prove that it was minimal death, then yes.
Okay, thank you.
The fact that he asked those questions means that he just hadn't had issues until that round. So he's been asking the North Korea question every round.
Yeah.
And he got here.
Yeah. So
So that's an example of like how you can like leverage your case, how you can give responses without like fully denying what they're saying. Like she agreed, like she agreed that like yeah, sure, sometimes it might be hard for people to flee their country, but like it's harder in an affirmative world to like overcome oppression. And that's something that's specifically good too, is they specifically talk about like overcoming oppression, how like revolutions harm human rights, result in mass killings. And so she's leveraging framework in the round to show that the affirmative and like violent revolutionaries just perpetuate oppression.
So any further thoughts or questions on that cross-examination?
Okay.
Any comments? Okay.
Yeah.
What would you say against her statement about
I don't know. It's
You
good.
would
It's
just simply
good.
not ask the question.
Yeah.
not make the argument that the affirmative was fake.
Yeah. Like.
That's just an, like, she just destroyed him. There's like, there's nothing.
Yeah.
At that point.
Round is over
Yeah.
after cross-X.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That's just awful.
Cross-X, just concede after
It was rough.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you're like in a situation like that where your opponent's that dominant in cross-examination, that might be something with your case. I feel.
Yeah.
Your arguments are that easy to like poke holes, so you probably need to restructure them.
Yeah, or like you like maybe need to do more research or find more examples. Like he like was getting owned in this round because he couldn't find like specific examples in the modern day of revolutions that didn't perpetuate oppression. And that was the issue, was that he wasn't able to provide that. He only provided historical examples, which conflicts with her observation. And that's another really important thing about this. He never in the 1AR, he never addressed the observation. He never touched it, which is really bad because suddenly his arguments about like his only example of a revolution being effective is suddenly you just shouldn't care about it because we can't apply it to modern day. So that also shows the importance of addressing observations, because like if you don't, sometimes you just lose.
Yeah. Kind of just like, also like the example of like what Sam was saying about historical examples or examples in general. When you're doing topic analysis, you want to like write down things that you should know about, because when opponents ask for examples of a certain thing happening, like if you don't provide it, it's really, really bad.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the cross-examination presentation. Are there any other questions before we go on to 1AR and negative rebuttals? Okay.
Wait, question for the people who haven't finished cases yet. How close are y'all to being done? Because if this takes until lunch, that would be really awkward because we have practice rounds right after lunch.
Yeah.
So if you need to work on cases.
So raise your hand if you still need to work on cases.
Okay. Would you all want to like? We can like take time to like address the 1NR when like 1AR later if like you want to work on cases.
As well.
What?
We can do like one-on-ones with people to like recover like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can,
Okay. So how do we want to do this then? We could like present still, or
Yeah, we can still present.
Okay.
If you want, if you can work while we're presenting, you can stay in here. If you will get distracted, you can also just like sit outside. I don't know, either one.
Yes.
But just to finish your case, and then we'll talk about these speeches like individually with you.
yeah.
So we'll catch you back up. Also, if you haven't submitted your case in the Google Classroom, please do that so that we know or can see the cases like this.
Yeah.
Okay, try to finish by 12:30. If it's not done by 12:30, everyone we've talked to so far has like at least a shell of a case
Yes.
that they will still be able to run. So we are going to run practice rounds with everyone.
Yeah. And we're the ones judging you, so we'll like we're not gonna say anything about case.
Yeah.
We know that it's just like a shell right now.
Guys, why isn't it done? Right, say that.
But
Yeah, so we had a solicited questions
Yes.
Okay, I was scared.
Yeah.
I like McDonald's.
Okay.
Alright, so we can start, so, yeah, presentation. What folder is it?
It's in Sam's slides. Okay. So we're gonna be going over strategies for. Oh, yep.
Are you guys gonna disclose right after the round?
We
We're probably not
practice
gonna
rounds?
make a decision.
No.
No, we're not making decisions for practice rounds.
We will give feedback though.
Is like the actual tournament gonna be powered
Yes.
starting when third round?
Wait, we only
Let me
have,
think. Wait, let me
Because
think.
what I saw was for prelim, semi-finals.
We'll either power. I think after round 2 is the norm. We might power after round 1. I don't know.
Round one.
We'll see.
Round one.
we'll see.
After
Yeah.
round one.
Okay.
You guys gonna be powering high-low or high-high?
Hi.
Why would we power?
Even
What?
in semifinals.
Well, no.
Well, no, like that's because that's seeded, but like in prelims, you'll be like going up against people who have the same record as you.
Out rounds when they're high.
Okay. So we're gonna be going over the 1AR, the 1NR, and also like small parts of rebuttals in the negative constructive, and what you should do during each of these speeches. Okay, so the 1AR. This is literally the hardest speech that you're ever going to give in Lincoln Douglas debate. And the reason is because the negative constructive that comes directly before this is 7 minutes long. They give their case, and in the same speech, they rebut your case. And so that's 7 minutes worth of arguments, and you have 4 minutes in this speech to respond to all of that. So you need to be really smart about the arguments you're making, what you're going for, and like sometimes there might be a really good argument that you know rebuts this, but it might just take too long to make the argument. And so it might turn into an issue. So time management is really important. Word economy is really important. And what I mean by that is you want to like speak as efficiently as possible and not include filler words. I'm really bad at this. If you hear my presentations or like re-listen to this, I say like a lot. And you don't want to do that in round. There's a lot of times where like I get into the habit of like saying words that will like try and make the point. So like for example, I always say, and I get made fun of saying the phrase. Oh, sorry, Jack.
No,
said
you're at
like
6
six
sentences.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, I'll get into the habit of like saying words that like make a point. This is what I mean. I'm better in rebuttals, but like, okay. Don't ignore that. Forget about it. Okay. Yeah. That. Yeah.
In this match?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We gotta get going. But
Okay, for time management quick though, so let's say your opponent has a case that looks like this, where their value is pretty light, their criterion is pretty light, and so is contention 1 and 2. In terms of time management, you obviously don't want to focus on framework or focus on these two contentions because the majority of offense is clearly in one place. In most examples, it won't be this obvious, but you can kind of reason out what arguments they're going for based on their previous speech and what they like cross-applied, if that makes sense. Did I say? Okay.
Yeah.
What they cross-apply to the other side of flow.
No, but I literally encountered a case like this though.
Yeah, that's-
Yeah.
That's Dustin.
Yeah.
That's Steve's F on the strikes.
Did he go to F or did he go to E? I don't remember.
I don't know, but yeah, like you're going to encounter cases like this, and you need to know what arguments are important, what you can make one argument on and then just go, and what you need to like group. There's a good chance that like examples where like the subpoints go from A to E, there's going to be stuff that's probably making the same point or that you can group together and just make the same amount of arguments on.
So like in this example, which of these three would you group together? Poverty, more poverty, and healthcare. Right. Poverty and more poverty.
Why?
Why do these get grouped?
It's both about poverty.
They have the same impact. It's crazy.
Same impact equals group. This you need to group or else you will drop
Yeah.
arguments. Always group. Because why would I respond to more poverty when I respond to poverty?
Okay.
Also, judges hate it when you repeat stuff on the flow.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is it called like cross-applying? Or can you
That's
just
another
say
thing.
that?
That.
Cross-applying is using your contention to respond to your opponent.
So like, let's say your negative, your contention 1 talks about how economic growth lifts people out of poverty. And then like the affirmative's contention 1 is talking about how environmental harms are actually going to put more people in poverty and like cause mass disruption in society, which is going to push people below the poverty line. So if the negative is talking about economic growth, you can get up there and say cross-apply my contention 1, which shows that economic harms are still going to occur in a negative world because of the impact that climate change has, which is just going to push people into poverty.
Yeah, and that's like whoever wrote on the board. So
Yeah.
grouping is different than like I think the question you're asking is like if you already made an argument on A, can you just say cross-apply my argument of A to B? But grouping is a way to like it's better word comedy. You just say group A B.
Unless they have like contention 3, subpoint C, poverty, and then
Oh
you
yeah,
can't
that
really
scenario.
Yeah.
group.
If they have like D, E, F,
Poverty.
more. Then in this scenario, you would say because you like saying group A, B, F is kind of confusing for the judge. So group A, B, cross apply. This.
Yeah, so you'd say like cross-apply the arguments I made on their contention, on their subpoint, contention 1, subpoint A and B about poverty, and this shows, yeah.
Another thing with cross applying, you never want to just say cross apply my arguments on A, B, and then move on. You need
Yeah.
to like reiterate.
Yeah, you need to like re-explain the warrant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Knowing what battles to take, I think we kind of already went over this.
Yeah.
With like the time management, you don't need to take a huge framework battle if you don't need to.
Yeah. Okay. How to make the 1AR easier before it even happens. So you want to be smart in your case construction. This is really important. You don't want to end up flowing yourself out of the 1AR just because you have a lot on the contention level that you can't possibly cover. The only point where like this is an okay strategy is because it can act as a time suck against the negative constructive speech, where they might like respond to you might have like 3 contentions. They'll respond to the contention 1, contention 2, contention 3 with a bunch of arguments, and then you just kick contention 1 and 2 and go for contention 3. So that's an example where like it's okay, but you need to understand that there are certain arguments and contentions where if you make too many, it's going to result in you just not being able to address everything. I'm not even noticing it now. Okay. Yeah.
We go on this side?
Yeah. Handling the 1AR. Okay, you want to leverage your case as much as possible. So the first reason for this is that instead of having to generate a completely new argument, you're just able to leverage what your opponent said, what you said in your case. So once again, cross-apply my contention 1, subpoint B, which shows that yada yada. Another thing that why this is really good is because you might have blocks written that like a pre-written card that responds to this that you don't read in case, but you'll read in rebuttal. Reading cards in the 1AR is really hard to do because it takes up so much time. You have to like give a tag, you have to cite the author, and then you have to quote them and then warrant it out. So like analytical arguments and cross-applying the cards you've already read make it so much easier. 8.
1, 8.
Okay, so cards generally are 15 seconds to 30 seconds. If you're really good at cutting, you could probably hair closer to 15. But reading a card, you just wasted an eighth of your speech, which is big. Don't read too many cards. Just like your 1 hour should be a lot more analysis.
Yeah. Also, you can leverage your framework for weighing too. So like, if you don't have responses, or you don't think that your responses are going to hold a lot of weight, you can say that while this argument may be true, understand that I'm winning on framework and there's no reason to prefer this on the framework level. So there's no reason to weigh it. And it just depends on the argument they're making. Sometimes that might not be true, and if so, you shouldn't make that argument. Yeah. Picking your battles, we already talked about this. Like, you should kick framework, you should group framework if they're really similar, and you understand, like, if you can't possibly address every part of your case, you should kick it too, and this is just going to happen in your debate career. Yeah. If something happens where your opponent put like 5 responses on one contention and you, for whatever reason, need to win on that contention, or you're going to lose the round, then you need to pick and choose which of those 5 responses are most important and which don't matter. I've done this before where like they'll make quick analytics that sound nice but don't really make a point or don't directly refute the warrant, and I just won't address it because there's other more substantial arguments they make where I know if I don't address it, I'll lose.
Like an example would be like, if they put like, a thing debaters do is that they read their general blocks that they prepped out for like the general argument, and then they'll read their actual arguments. So like, the general blocks usually should not be applicable to your argument in the first place, so you can focus on these two. But again, don't just leave this one hanging because it can be a problem sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, and lastly, definitions. If you run a definition and your opponent runs a different definition, if it doesn't matter, don't argue it, because definition debates are 1, really boring, and 2, not fun. I don't know. Like, you should only do it if they're actually they're actually like leveraging it in their case to completely redefine the round, or they're using it against your case to explain why what you're talking about isn't like, it shouldn't be discussed under the resolution, because this isn't what that is. For example, like I ran one of the resolutions a couple years ago was about lethal autonomous weapons, killer robots, and my negative talked about how lethal autonomous weapons and like AI in missile defense systems is necessary to defend against missiles that are getting faster. I had an opponent at Qualls run a definition in their case that said lethal means deadly. So, and then he got up and made a response that said, because these missile defense systems aren't killing anything, they're not deadly, therefore they're not lethal. And so you need to respond to stuff like that, or else they're able to leverage it. And so you need to get into a definition debate.
This is also like going back, like you guys remember when we were about to choose the deterrence topic. This is a very, very big reason why we chose to switch it, because I think Catherine and I disagree on this to some extent, but we both agree it like muddies the debate. But like, deterrence is like a form of art that refers to like 1 of 5 avenues of punishment, like rehabilitation, etc. But what counts as deterrence is a very, very like ongoing debate within the criminal justice system. Specifically, there are people who advocate for therapy as a form of deterrence, and also like people who advocate for like policing as a form of deterrence.
See, I
So,
disagree
like,
with this, 'cause
yes,
I didn't think it was
but wait.
true.
I think it is true, because it's an ongoing debate. Yada yada yada. Okay, but like the thing is that like, because there's so many things you can say about deterrence, or like so many, like even if it's not true, the fact that debaters can just be like, okay, I think deterrence should be this, and then just go off that with the definitions debate makes it like really awful debate. So.
This is especially difficult with the 1AR because you already have to respond to 2 frameworks and at least like 4 contentions usually, and just adding on like definitions to that is going to be too much. Grouping arguments. We've talked about this. It's efficient. It can be done on negative as well. Understand a lot of the arguments we're talking about that the 1AR can do. You can do the exact same things on the negative if it's effective for you. So don't rule anything out just because we talk about it on one side. It can be done on the other side too.
Yep, and again, just to reiterate, the general rule is that if they have a similar impact or the same impact,
Yep. When not to kick. Okay, there's sometimes when you shouldn't kick in the 1AR. So after the first negative constructive, are you winning on the argument? If they just undercovered it, or it's a unique impact that only you can access, that you can make a unique voter for your side that the negative doesn't get access to, that might be another reason to not kick it, weigh it out, make it a voter, because it's unique to your side. So if you're winning on it, generally don't kick it unless you're winning on something more, and you need to address that. Was the argument turned? We'll get into what turns are. We've talked about it a bit, but we're going to go in depth a bit. If your opponent takes your argument
apply to, and you will have more time to work on your case. Hi, everyone. Hi. Did Jack say hi? Yeah. Oh, hi, Jack. Okay. So we're going to talk about argument generation after that, and hopefully with the knowledge that you have from this presentation, you will be able to generate more arguments, or better arguments. Okay. These are the things that we will cover. Yes.
So yeah, for those who just got out of the debate round, or the practice debate round, very confused on how to respond to arguments, we are going to here to
Okay, there's two types of responses you have. One is carded responses. So if you've done debate before, you probably have done this before, but it's like you have prepared evidence in advance to go against things that you think you are going to approach. Second type is analytical responses. So this is what we mean when we say analytics, which is that there are responses that you can make without evidence that can be prepared or unprepared. So you can think of just statements relying on logic, and you can write them down somewhere before you go into the round if you think you'll hit the argument. And you can also come up with them in the round. So this is going to be about analytical responses, or what I like to call how you do as little research as possible, because I don't like researching things or knowing. I like knowing as little as possible to do well. And we're also going to talk about these in terms of coming up with the responses on the spot. I think that relying on blocks is probably not as useful as going into each round trying to generate your own responses, because if you are always relying on blocks, even if your blocks are really good, and you approach someone who is running something that you don't have blocks against, then you're super unprepared. Okay. First thing we're going to talk about is assumptions. So each argument makes like 5 different assumptions. Some of these we've talked about before. The first is like the initial premise. So like sometimes we don't ask ourselves if the first thing is even true, especially when people read cards where it's like, Pursuit in 2022 says that like the earth is going to die tomorrow or something. And we just like kind of take this as fact. But if they don't explain why, especially in the card, you can still like question if the argument is even true to begin with. The second thing is like links, and that is those like arrows we drew from one argument leading to another. That is, does one thing actually cause another? And can you think of reasons why it might not be true? Third thing is impacts. Like you can make arguments for why an impact is not actually a good thing. Obviously, a lot of those impacts on this topic, you can't. Like, you probably are not going to be able to say that climate change is something that is good. You're probably also not going to say that poverty is good. But some things, like Belt and Road Initiative or trade, are things that you can argue on being good or bad. Fourth assumption is uniqueness. So this one is very powerful, as in if you can just like come up with things in your head that are other reasons why something might occur, then that's really good, because then you can like minimize their argument pretty heavily. Because if someone is like, what's an argument that could be like this? I'm only thinking of Kira's case, which I don't want to reveal.
Farming causes climate change.
Farming causes climate change. Okay, there are other things that also cause climate change. So the idea is that like you can be like, oh, manufacturing is like so much worse for the climate. So like if you get rid of farming, then this like does nothing to actually lead to like the claim that you were making about how climate change is so bad and we should solve it, because you don't do anything to solve it. Fifth thing is, does the AF/neg solve the problem? So this is like you trying to think of not just the individual argument, but looking back to the resolution and asking yourself what the AF or neg is actually doing. For example, if neg makes an argument that's like, we need economic growth for this, this, and this, and you should like try to ask yourself, are these things that we would actually curb in the affirmative world? Like if they're talking about something that contributes to the economy, but does not actually like decrease environmental protection at all, like you can keep all of those things in your world. So thinking about whether or not doing the actual advocacy, so protecting the environment or protecting like economic growth or whatever, is actually going to address whatever impacts they are talking about. Okay, we are going to practice with this argument. So this is an argument that AF is making. They say the climate will rise 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030, causing billions of dollars of infrastructure to be at risk, so we have to act to stop climate change. Okay, can someone tell me an assumption this is making? Yes.
That like we're gonna stay in the status quo, so there aren't gonna be like any large changes in how we're accelerating climate change.
Okay, assuming squo. Yes. How can we use this to generate a response for Candy? Yes, you can continue.
That like China has incentive to solve climate change with like the economy in some way.
Yes, so true. Okay. I don't know. That's for you to find out. China has incentive. We're actually going to talk about incentives as a whole other set of like how you can respond to arguments. But this is, when I say this is assuming the status quo, this is assuming the initial premise is true, that the climate will rise 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. Like obviously whatever study that this is drawing on is drawing on things that are happening right now. If there's action taken within the next like 8 years or whatever to slow that growth, then that statistic changes. What's another assumption that this is making? So we've dealt with like initial premise. Yes, Jack.
So like in isolation, I guess it's not quite unique because China like might not be contributing that much.
Yes. Uniqueness. China not only contributor. China not only da-da-da-da-da. Okay. Yeah, so this can generate an argument that's like, obviously China is not the only thing that is required to stop climate change. So if you're like the US, Russia, I don't know, Germany, other huge emitters also are still going to exist, then you don't actually get to this ending conclusion where you're like, we have to act to stop climate change, because you don't stop climate change. And maybe all this does is mitigate the argument. Like maybe they're going to be like, okay, we don't solve all of it, but it's like only 1.2 degrees now. Even if that's true, like that probably still reproduces all of the impacts that the AF is talking about later in their case. What's another assumption this is making? Jack?
That climate change is something that can be stopped. So when we're looking at billions of dollars in infrastructure, how much of that impact is negated by baked-in climate change and the impacts that have already happened that can't be reversed?
Yeah, so when we stop like economic growth, like there's still carbon in the or not when you stop economic growth, but like if we like completely stopped all emissions happening in the world right now, there's still carbon in the atmosphere. There's still things like cloud cover that make it such that temperatures are still higher. There are still more extreme weather events that are destroying infrastructure. And so even if we try to stop climate change in its tracks, all the damage it has done is still happening and will still cause infrastructure development. So this is like almost another uniqueness argument that like it still happens. Still happens. Okay, any other assumptions? What about Pursoon?
There was like the billions of dollars of infrastructure risk.
How can you generate an argument from that?
There's no like guarantee that this infrastructure is at risk.
Okay, what if they're like, it's at risk because of natural disasters? Like that's the idea behind this.
What's the probability of natural disaster? Like, not probability.
Yeah, you can make arguments about probability, like maybe natural disasters don't happen as much. I think another argument you can make though is like, something that I think is useful is thinking about like, all of these things you talk about in a debate round are things that people know about, hence why the evidence exists. If people know that this is going to happen, that the climate is going to cause this much destruction, then people are like risk averse, right? Like nobody wants this to happen. So if it is true that this is going to happen and people know about it, then maybe there are things that people are going to do in reaction, which is like, maybe they will try to strengthen infrastructure to be able to adapt to a changing climate. So the assumption is that infrastructure stays the same, which isn't necessarily true, right? Infrastructure can change. It can be like fortified maybe in the future, and the reason why it could be fortified or why people have an incentive to fortify infrastructure is because like they expect this impact to happen, if that makes sense. Any other assumptions? There's one about like solvency, like does the AF solve the problem? I think we actually addressed that somewhat with like these two. I think there's some overlap with these like assumptions as well. I feel like I had another argument in my mind. I forgot what it was though. This is already 5 arguments, which is a lot. That's a lot of arguments. They're all good arguments that you can make. Okay. Second thing we're going to talk about is incentives. So we talked about this a little bit with Kira telling us that China has an incentive to like not screw over everything by letting the climate continue on its like destructive path. We also talked about incentives here where it's like people have an incentive to want to protect infrastructure, especially if they expect something's going to happen. So some questions that you should ask are, what do different actors want and why? So we talked about actors referring to people or groups of people, so governments or like institutions being actors that implement policies or do things. And all of them have incentives that drive their actions. So China right now has an incentive for economic growth, hence why that is like the topic, like that is what, like negatives generally the status quo. Why do they have that incentive? Because maybe it does things like, I don't know, it gives them status as a global superpower or whatever. Okay, so that affects their actions because maybe they because they have this incentive to become a global superpower, maybe that leads to some backlash argument that Sam talked about when he talked about like arguments you can make on this topic. That's like, if China loses their power, then in response, they are going to do something to try to regain that power that is going to be much worse, like maybe expanding their military capabilities. So this is all about reaction. I think usually in a debate, you think of the immediate impact of an argument. So things like
climate change is really bad and it's going to cause these issues, or poverty is really bad and it's going to cause these issues. You can also think about how people respond to the fact that these impacts happen. So if I say that poverty is going to happen, maybe China will respond by being like, okay, China has an incentive to not have 800 million people be in poverty anymore. So maybe the response is that like they implement some sort of policy to try to reduce that without spurring more economic growth, because that's not within like the realm of the affirmative or whatever. Does that make sense? Can I get like a thumbs up, thumbs, middle, down? Okay, cool. Let's do this example. I don't know, maybe I'll write over here. Okay. So negative makes this argument. Economic downturn pushes millions of Chinese citizens into economy. So this is what I just talked about, which is that China has an incentive to not like literally screw over their economy, because like economic downturn threatens their status as a global superpower. Like all of the reasons that Neg is going to cite to you as to why economic downturn is so bad is something that China wants to avoid. So maybe in the interim, they're going to do things, or maybe as a reaction, they're going to do things to try to recoup those economic losses. And maybe it's not going to be as significant as it would have been had they just gone like full on like super capitalist, we're only prioritizing economic growth, but it's still going to minimize a lot of the arguments that the affirmative makes. So maybe they'll do things like invest in education and innovation efforts to develop like a green job sector to fill in all of the jobs lost in manufacturing. Maybe they're going to do things like redistribution policies. So there are reasons why this might be untrue though, but if you can list like specific things that China would have the incentive to do that would like solve a lot of the problems that your opponent is talking about as a reaction to like realizing that these problems exist, then that's like very strong ground for you, because nothing exists like in a vacuum, or like usually when an impact happens, it does not end at the impact. There are people who are like, we don't want this impact to happen, so they're going to do something in response in order to try to minimize it. Okay, so as a practice, we're going to try to respond to that response. So if I am negative and I'm making that argument, what are some things I can talk about as to why this argument that Af just made against me is untrue, using either assumptions or incentives? Candy, anyone? Like, why wouldn't China do things like invest in education and innovation for a green job sector? Kira?
There can be like certain situations where the government has goals that aren't aligned with like education, like if that would require a sacrifice in like an industry that they need because of increase in funding, they might not have motivation to do so. They have like other stronger priorities that would need funding instead.
Okay, what other priorities would they have?
I'd say maybe like COVID relief, like they're probably not gonna try to fund education when they want to spend more money on COVID relief.
Yeah, so maybe they do things like COVID relief. But I think the thing with this argument, though, is that maybe like this idea that, because this is like solving poverty or whatever, like the AF response is like this addresses like this poverty impact. I think COVID relief also maybe does that. So if they do more COVID relief as a response, that's also maybe good. Or like if they invest that way. But okay, but that would be a response to like this idea that they're like recouping economic losses, because this doesn't necessarily like lead to more GDP growth. So if they do this instead, you still cut back on like this impact of that AF tells you that like you're going to develop a green job sector or like redistribute monies or whatever. So yeah, that would still be a good argument to get uniqueness as to why you it's on now. I feel like I clicked the off button. Okay. Or it just wasn't on the entire time. That would have been cool too. Jack.
Long-term harms can turn into almost systemic issues where you're dealing with a problem that is far more entrenched. It's the violence inherent in the system as opposed to short-term harms, which aren't as entrenched.
Yes, so that idea that if we don't address, or if we, like, some long-term harms become, like, entrenched into systems and they would become much harder to address. Okay. Any other ideas? Oh, yes.
Long-term harms tend to affect more people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the scope of these is usually just much wider, which is why most people are, like, think that, like, long-term harms you should address first. So, like, climate change is something that is, like, going to be really, really bad. And maybe this, like, ties into how catastrophic it is. Another thing you can think about with short-term harms is, like, generations. Oh, I guess that's the second question, so I'll just talk about it here. So the idea that, I guess it depends on, like, the short-term, long-term thing. Like, if it's, like, 5 years versus, like, 80 years, or no, 5 years versus, like, 50 years, then maybe it's not, like, totally different generations. But in terms of, like, climate change, the point at which climate change becomes an existential impact and literally kills everybody is probably not going to happen within the next, like, within your lifetime. Like, maybe life will get worse for you because of climate change, but it probably won't be the existential impact that some people are going to argue yet. So the idea is that you're making decisions based on people who, like, literally don't exist yet. And maybe that's unethical because you should prioritize people who, like, are currently being affected by things versus people who are hypothetically going to be affected by things in the future. Yep, Dwyer.
This is another one for short-term, but short-term impacts are more, they have a higher probability since they might have a higher probability probability versus a long-term impact that can be possibly changed.
Okay, yes. Probability, short term. You have 2 years to solve something versus you have 100 years to do so. You have tons of time to think of innovative solutions that maybe no one even has, like, research about yet in order to fix things like climate change. Versus, like, if you put people into poverty now, like, you will, like, that impact will happen. Like, climate change happening, like, in a long time from now can still be addressed via, like, things that maybe you don't even have the capacity to talk about right now. So yeah, that addresses the first things. Another thing is, like, does one thing cause something else? So we talked about with these two justifications. Like, if you don't deal with it now, it turns into long-term harms. Short-term harms also, like, become much worse in the future. Another thing is, like, so the arguments that, like, you need the economy to function in order to invest in climate innovation is an argument about one thing causing something else. So the idea that you can basically steal ground from your opponent by saying that all of the impacts that they talk about are actually things that I can access via what I'm talking about. So that's that thing. Last thing is weighing metrics. We have already talked about weighing metrics. So I don't know if anyone needs a refresher, but I think we generally have the idea about, like, likelihood, probability. Those are literally the same thing. Likelihood, scope, magnitude, etc. Okay. Practice. Okay. We're going to use the same argument because I was really creative making these slides. Economic downturn pushes millions of Chinese citizens into poverty. How do we respond to this by outframing them? So we're not making arguments about why this is untrue. So we are going to accept that this will happen. Why can we still win this argument? And we are the affirmative. We are saying we'll prioritize the environment. Guys, 2 pieces of candy for this one. Siane?